China. We are speaking to you about, well, an aspect that's a little different than the focus that we primarily have had on the unrestricted warfare in which the Chinese Communist Party has been engaged against us for decades, and instead focusing on, well, the evidence that the Chinese are preparing to move into an even more dangerous phase, a shooting war against America and presumably its friends and allies in the Western Pacific as well. We are having this conversation against the backdrop of a series of high-level meetings, including with Chinese President and dictator Xi Jinping, conducted by Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor. The readout on his meetings, including with Xi, has been that he has made progress in reducing bilateral tensions and improving military-to-military relations as well. I'm given to understand that there is now in the offing another of the notorious phone calls between President Xi and the man formerly known as President Joe Biden. One can only imagine what that conversation will entail in this period in which even the president's own political party has deemed him unfit to serve as president at least 5 months from now. And I think from the point where they made that known to him and effected his removal from the ticket, they have not seen much of Joe Biden off the beach in Delaware. So the question really is, where does the truth lie in all of this? Have tensions between the United States and China actually been materially improved by Jake Sullivan, no less? Are the nature of relations between the two militaries in general improving? And specifically, what about the elements of those militaries that are going to be particularly relevant in the event there is, unfortunately, a shooting war, instigated, of course, by the Chinese Communist Party in the Pacific and East Asia, predominantly known, of course, for their broad ocean areas. And that would mean the navies, the United States Navy and the People's Liberation Army Navy. Today, we've pulled together an extraordinarily formidable group of our colleagues and duty experts on things Navy and maritime more generally, to address a kind of net assessment. If war is in prospect now, and I think that's the very least that can be said, shooting war, that is, how ready is the United States Navy to do the role that it would largely be responsible for of safeguarding our vital interests, our friends and allies, our forces abroad, as well as, of course, protecting this country as well from attack by the Chinese Communist Navy and other elements of the People's Liberation Army. We're going to begin with an overview that an old friend and colleague, Seth Cropsey, former Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy, and now the president of the Yorktown Institute, is going to provide us via video that will establish some of the factors that are operating in that net assessment and set the stage for the conversations that will follow from others on this very, very formidable panel. So let's go to the videotape with Secretary Seth Cropsey now.
The Navy has experienced serious problems over the past 10 to 15 years. One of the important points that has to be made is that the Navy today is a little bit more, has a little bit more than 280 ships in its combat fleet. That compares with more than twice that number at the end of the Cold War, when it was just shy of 600 ships. And the Chinese Navy has increased to 370 ships. The numbers do not simply tell the story. It's a difference in forces that tells the story. It's there's a geographic component to this, because the United States Navy, despite its 280 ships, deploys only about 100 at once. And that's because ships require maintenance and repair and going to and from their where they're deployed, and major overhauls. And our Navy is dispersed around the globe by intent, deliberately, whereas the Chinese can concentrate their naval forces in the West Pacific and the South China Sea. And even though there's been a redistribution that has slightly increased our presence in the West Pacific region, the Chinese hold a significant advantage in numbers, not only at sea, but as a result of their huge arsenal of land-based missiles and their equally impressive land-based naval aviation, in other words, planes that are based on land but can operate and do operate at sea, and also as a result of a policy of China's that is well over 25 years old, about 25 years old, a little bit older, of denying access to the American fleet up to 1,000 miles from the Chinese mainland. And that's important because the range of our carrier-based aircraft does not allow us to threaten Chinese targets unless we come within that area where they've heavily defended the sea space. So in addition to that, you might, and some of your readers might have noticed that the Military Sea Lift Command, and I don't want to get into an overly technical explanation of these issues here, but the Military Sea Lift Command is in large measure responsible for providing logistics to our fleet at sea, especially. And some of you might have noticed that there was a plan announced on this past Friday, almost a week ago, to decrease the Military Sea Lift Command by 17 ships as a result of manpower problems. A military that has bases and access to bases, a Navy, that is to say, that has access to bases, it does fine, but especially in peacetime. But if that access is in any way impeded by combat operations, then it must rely on the sea for resupply of things like fuel, ammunition, repairs, parts, so on and so forth. So that decrement of 17 ships out of about 125 is significant. And the ready reserve fleet that we have is aging. Many of the ships are 50 years or older. So the general picture is of unpreparedness. and budget and in part self-restrained limitations that prevent the Navy from being as effective as it ought to be in deterring a war in the West Pacific. And that says nothing about other potential enemies like Russia or Iran or North Korea or some combination of them at the same time. The strategic question that hangs over the use of our naval and maritime forces capability. And that question is, how would the Navy be used in a conflict in the West Pacific? I was interviewed a few days ago on the question of logistics, and the interviewer asked, "How much logistics do we actually need for a conflict, just say with China?" And I said, "Well, that's a really good question because it depends upon what our strategy would be. Is our strategy to break a blockade of Taiwan? Is it to sink the Chinese fleet? Is it to blind the command infrastructure which is necessary to operate that fleet? Is it to blockade China itself? Is it to cut off China from the exports and imports on which its economy relies? What does that mean? How would it be accomplished?" Those questions may have been addressed by the Navy, but there is no public articulation, even of the generalities, and I hope it's not necessary, but I will say so in any case. I'm not looking for, and the people who are asking this question are not looking for the Navy to say, we're going to do this on the first day, we're going to do this on the second day, we're going to do this on the third day. But there was a maritime strategy toward the end of the Cold War, and it was explicit, although it didn't give the Soviets the details, and that was to threaten them on their seaborne flanks in the Mediterranean, the northern seas, and the Pacific in such a way as to divert their attention from the central front on the ground in Germany, on the continent. Some idea like that is missing today. It is at least missing in the public discussion. And absent that idea, it is extremely hard to make the argument for a larger fleet, to say nothing of what kind of fleet is needed. And one of the disparities between the U.S. and the Chinese fleet, besides the numerical one, is that, for example, the Chinese surface ships are more designated for, more designed for, more intended to conduct anti-surface operations than our surface fleet, especially our cruisers, which we're getting rid of, which are primarily anti-air platforms and are meant to protect a carrier battle group. And I was speaking before about the problems with a carrier battle group and the access that's denied or is attempted to be denied to them by the Chinese. So there's a sort of a delta, a mismatch there between what China sees, which is more in the direction of a large fleet engagement, and what the U.S. sees, which is extensive use of traditional carrier-borne naval aviation. Our industrial base is not sufficient for the task of building a minimum of 355 ships, which is the Navy's current goal over a 30-year period. But I do not think that we have 30 years to answer the mail on this problem. A former commander of the Indo-Pacific Command, Admiral Phil Davidson, whose name has been attached to a window, the Davidson window, said several years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, that he expected that China would attack Taiwan by 2027. Who knows? But at least in the mind of one extremely well-informed person, there's a real threat, and it's not 30 years away. The most important thing is to decide what the strategy for dealing with China would be, for deterring China, and if necessary, defeating China. After that, it would be clearer what kinds of ships should be built. And after it is clearer what kinds of ships should be built, not just the Navy, but Congress and the administration need to fund that plan in a consistent way over an extended period of time, not just 2 or 3 years or 5 years. And that will give the shipyards the incentive that they need to hire workers and train them, because the lack of skilled, trained workers is a critical issue today in building the fleet. The strategy ought to be to choke China so that it cannot export and import the goods that it needs to survive, and at the same time to attack the fleet, to sink the Chinese fleet.
Comprehensive introduction to the subject, from quantitative and qualitative disparities between the two forces, U.S. Navy and the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy, the missions that they have, the strategy that we should have, and the kind of capabilities that it will require in a whole host of areas. We will drill down, I think, with our other panelists on each of those subjects, and probably in some questions and answers at the end. But thank you, Secretary Cropsey, for your service to our country, but the service you've just rendered by that very helpful introduction. We're going to turn next to Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired, a man who has been in uniform, among other things, the Chief of Intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He has also, since he left the service, been arguably one of, certainly, perhaps the most insistent of the experts on China, and especially its military, in warning that it is gunning for us, and that there is a window, a decade of concern, as he's called it for many years, in which we now find ourselves, in which China can be deemed both ready for conflict with the United States and apparently intent on engaging in it. He is the columnist for American Greatness, with a man with whom he has co-authored an important new book, Dr. Bradley Thayer, a member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China, as is Captain Fennell, I'm proud to say. The book's title is Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. Captain Fennell, we've asked you to bring to bear your training as a skilled intelligence officer to help flesh out Secretary Cropsey's net assessment, especially as it relates to the current and incipient capabilities of the Chinese Navy, and a situation report, if you will, on your old service, especially its elements in the Pacific. Welcome back, sir. It's good to have you with us. Over to you.
Well, Frank, it's great to be with you, and it's always great to follow Seth Cropsey, who's laid out a very solid foundation, and I'm looking forward to hearing remarks from Captain Bolton and Colonel Newsham as well. I would echo Seth's opening statement. When I joined the U.S. Navy and was commissioned in August of 1986, we had just under 600 ships in the United States Navy. And by the time I left, we were at around 290, and we're, as he mentioned, in the 280s right now. Concurrently, the Chinese Navy has essentially doubled in size in that same time period. So what you have is strategic trend lines. You have a trend line of America's Navy being cut in half, while the Chinese Navy has doubled. And they've not only doubled in the number of hulls, but they've doubled their size in terms of tonnage. In fact, over the last decade, China's outproduced the Navy in terms of tonnage, much greater than the U.S. Navy. They're outproducing us each year of 4 to 5 ships to every one that we produce. And as well, they are also catching up with us and soon will surpass us in the number of vertical launch cells that fire the host of weapons that we need to win a war at sea or to maintain air superiority around our carrier strike groups or amphibious expeditionary groups and whatnot. Just 2016, we had almost a 10-to-1 ratio over the PLA Navy, and today it's maybe 2-to-1, and it's soon will be below 1-to-1. So China has, as Seth mentioned, invested heavily in fighting and winning wars at sea. And so their Navy is quite capable. And I know I get that question a lot, is how capable are they? And they are very capable. They're spending a lot of time at sea around not just the Indo-Pacific, where they dominate the first and second island chain, that 1,000-mile range that Seth talked about, out to Guam. But they routinely have been for the last 15 years operating in the Central Command AOR, where they have maintained every day for 365 days a year a surface action group, a 3-ship naval task force that has been escorting their ships and conducting exercises with the Iranians, the Russians, and others. And then those ships, at the conclusion of their 3 to 4 month deployments into the Gulf area, will head up into the Mediterranean, where they'll circumnavigate the Horn of Africa or the continent of Africa. We've seen a lot of activity in the Atlantic and the Gulf of Guinea, where they're showing their flag and influencing operation or governments in Africa. We've seen them operational in the Mediterranean, exercising with the Russians, the Baltic, exercising with the Russians. And then obviously they're heading down into the South Pacific, where they're making influence there in the South Pacific Islands. They also head to Latin America. So they are growing and becoming a global Navy, while at the same time, as was mentioned, we are now taking 17 of our USNS ships offline, potentially, which will have a dramatic impact, not just on the merchant fleet or our resupply fleet, but that will have a direct impact on carrier operations and amphibious operations, submarine operations, and all of that. And so and even down into Navy special warfare. So we will have a dramatic impact on the scope and capabilities of the U.S. Navy. Chinese weapon systems that are on board their ships are quite capable. Supersonic, high-speed anti-ship cruise missiles like the YJ-18 with a 300-kilometer-mile range, which is greater than anything the U.S. has in terms of a supersonic weapon. Those are equipped on their submarines. Almost all of their lately produced surface ships and released from naval aircraft as well. So they're really designed a Navy not only to give us a problem inside that 1,000-mile arc, but they've designed a Navy that's designed to rule the waves, to defeat all other navies, when the only other Navy that could possibly threaten them is the U.S. Navy. And so while they've been accelerating, we have been declining. And the declines are really stark, and I know that the other two guests will talk about some of that, but let me just say that in April of this year, our own Secretary of the Navy, Del Toro, called for a 45-day assessment of what was going on because the Navy had to announce up to 11 years of delays in the production of some of our ships, like the Columbus-class SSBN that will be delayed 12 to 16 months, or the 4th and 5th blocks of the Virginia-class SSN, fast attack submarine, that will be delayed 36 to 24 months, and the Constellation-class frigate, which is delayed another 3 years, 36 months, as well as our next aircraft carrier, the Enterprise CVN-80, will be delayed by a year and a half to over 2 years. These are major delays that are driven largely by the fact that America's shipbuilding industry has gone into atrophy over the last 35 to 40 years. One of the results of the quote-unquote peace dividend, where we essentially said we didn't have to continue building ships at the rate that we were. That maritime strategy that Seth talked about essentially went into hibernation, and America's shipbuilding industry started to decline. So much so that we see, China has 13 major naval shipyards compared to just 7 for the United States. And of the Chinese 13 shipyards, just one of them in Zhongnongdao, off the mouth of the Yangtze River in Shanghai, is actually larger than all of our 7 shipyards. So we're in a crisis when it comes to shipyard manufacturing and capabilities to produce new hulls. We also have a great problem when it comes to the maintenance of our ships. Dr. Jerry Hendricks, former Navy captain, put out an article this last year called Sunk at the Pier, Crisis in the American Submarine Industrial Base. And we have a significant problem with dry docks for our U.S. submarine fleet, so much so that 1/3 of the United States nuclear submarine force is essentially not at sea because they cannot finish and complete their repairs. So we are in a dramatic crisis right now. And as you mentioned, and as Seth mentioned about this 2027, I've called it the decade of concern. We are very likely going to see the People's Republic of China and the Chinese Communist Party follow through with their stated goal of restoring Taiwan into the motherland. And they've tried quite extensively for the last several decades to restore Taiwan through non-kinetic means, through economic coercion, through diplomatic coercion and isolation, through political warfare and information warfare. And through it all, the people of Taiwan have said, no, we don't want to be part of the People's Republic of China. Well, along that continuum of time, those 30 years, the military has built up. And now the PLA and the people in the Central Military Commission have been able to tell Xi, hey, we have the capability to do this. And Xi has recognized that. In fact, he just appointed a new Minister of Defense here this year. And that Minister of Defense is Admiral Dong Jun. He's the first Navy admiral to lead the People's Republic of China's military. The PLA is being led by a Navy admiral. And this Navy admiral a decade ago was running the first ever East China Sea Joint Operations Command Center out of the Fujian. So this guy that's leading the PLA has spent his life, essentially his professional life as a flag officer, focused on taking Taiwan. And on a daily basis, we see China dominating the military waves around Taiwan in the South China Sea. We even mentioned what's been going on for the last 3 or 4 months down in the Spratlys and other areas where Chinese Navy combatants are in the Gulf of Alaska and other places. So we're in a really crisis situation with an emergent, not an emergent anymore, a real threat from the PLA Navy. And we are not prepared in any way, shape, or form. And we need to take drastic action right now. And it sounds hyperbolic, I know, to some people, but this is a crisis that was 30 plus years in the making. And we're going to have to do something extreme to rectify this. Otherwise, China will rule the waves.
Captain Fennell, a bracing situation report and net assessment. And we will come back to you, I'm quite sure, in the question and answer period about what kinds of actions you believe must be taken. We'll get a sense of that from our colleagues as well. The next of whom is Captain Jay Bolton. He is a retired skipper in the United States Merchant Marine. He is these days a maritime consultant. He also has, to his credit, the ratings as a tanker and tall ships master, as well as being a founder of the United States Maritime Foundation. We've asked Captain Bolton to pick up on some of the points that have been made by Seth and by Jim about the challenge in particular of the aging of our vessels, both combatants and those that support them, as well as the manning of the fleet. And again, it's supporting merchant marine assets as well. Captain Bolton, it is a privilege to have you with us again, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me on again and to talk about a topic very, very close to my heart. What I'm going to do is give you a brief overview of the history of the decline of the merchant marine component for the last 60 years. And that's the decline of the fleet and the human resources, and then maybe talk about some solutions. So in order to do that, I've got to take you a little walk through history, starting back to 1965. All right, what a beautiful ship. In 1965, the Vietnam War was raging, and President Johnson was confronted with a sea lift issue. The ships were waiting for months to get crew members to sail with the necessary supplies to Vietnam. They tried to have us graduate from the military colleges without degrees. They wanted us to deploy immediately. That was negotiated, and eventually we graduated early. So 1 hour after graduation, I flew to Japan to join this first beautiful yacht, shuttling jet fuel and aviation fuel from Japan to Vietnam. I walked up aboard, and I was shocked. The only other person with a license was the captain. Everybody else was foreign flag, foreigners. The ships were sailing under waivers because they needed the people. They did not have the people. There's another ship. I just mentioned the age of that ship. That was like a World War II relic. And then I go to another ship that I served as chief mate on for a while, 1974. I was then a sea lift crisis even in the 70s. This was shuttling jet fuel and aviation fuel to Bremerton, Washington. Before we loaded in Bannerman Shore, I happened to look at the draft, and this is what I found. How is it possible that a ship the Navy was so desperate for sea lift that they would allow ships to sail with extensions of shipyard periods just to get the product over? So this is indicative of the condition of the fleet then used and the sailors sailing them. So in 1984, there was a 4-year commission form called the Commission on Merchant Marine and Defense. And the whole purpose of this 4-year study was to determine whether or not a merchant marine was even necessary and whether or not there was the shipyard base to build ships. Well, as Captain Fennell just indicated, this is 50 years ago, and we still have this problem today. It's exacerbated. Subsequent to that, I helped organize this meeting with the Navy League, and very clearly, that was the commission. This is what I organized here, and the same conclusion. We're in deep doo-doo, and there's no time to waste. We need to have a major merchant marine policy, and we can see nothing has changed at all. A year later, we have Operation Desert Shield. And those in the military know what a disaster it was. It took us more than 6 months to get our material over the Middle East. The King of Spain was concerned that we were invading him because all of our old ships being pulled out of the RRF were being towed into Spain for repairs. And we even had people going back to sea as old as 82 years old because we did not have the people. It was incredible. Post to that, I had attended a meeting at the War College where Admiral Borda, then the Chief of Naval Operations, gave a great speech. He talked about, well, we're going to correct the sea lift problem by buying some foreign flag ships for the MSC. And so I simply asked, what about the personnel? If we don't have a commercial fleet, where are we going to support the fleet as it expands? He declined to answer that. He went on to another topic. So this is a wonderful chart that shows kind of in a ballpark what has happened to the U.S. merchant fleet. Kind of amazing. 180 ships compared to our competitors. And look at the largest ship owners. There's not one U.S. ship owner in that, obviously. COSCO is China Ocean Shipping Company. And so all of the money we spend on all of our economics is cash flow out rather than cash flow in by a U.S. flag companies. We simply can't afford to compete. And so now these are the key issues that I see. The most important is there's no will and no leadership within our government to really address the situation. There's not national competition for personnel. What I mean by that is, why would anybody want to go to sea on a container ship, spend months at sea, if he's not compensated at a competitive wage level as opposed to those working ashore? Why would one want to work in a shipyard if they did not have a consistent means of earning a living? Then there's the international competition issues, the unlevel playing field, where our sailors cannot compete, work with the international wage scales and get a job. The Jones Act is a complicated issue, but the commercial shipyard is another issue. We don't have the capacity. And then let me focus on the maritime colleges. The primary feed for merchant mariners. We have 5 state maritime colleges and Kings Point. I'm amazed these colleges are going woke. They are diversifying away from the maritime industry, getting into non-seafaring programs. And so those who do go to sea, they go to sea for a short period of time, and then they go get a shoreside job. So there's no emphasis on really focusing on providing people for the maritime industry, other than Military Sea Lift Command, MSC. And the wage scales for MSC and the work requirements for MSC, it's not a good business decision to go into the Military Sea Lift Command because of the wage disparities and the work requirements. Organized labor, you gentlemen know that organized labor is deadly set against changing the Jones Act, maintenance and cure, lots of issues, which makes us very uncompetitive. And maybe the biggest thing is, as Captain Fennell has mentioned, is the industrial base. We don't have the shipyards. There's not the economic incentive to create additional shipyards. And these are issues that you gentlemen can address, obviously, that I can. And finally, there needs to be the will and the leadership. But if there's none of that, then there won't be any solutions. But I suggest that the merchant marine needs to become called the merchant marine, where we focus on the economics of developing our commerce and trade with merchant ships. That will solve the manpower issues, and that'll solve some of the other issues. So that's all I have for now. I hope this is answers your questions. Over.
Very much so, Captain. You've added a lot of texture, and especially important because I think that these issues, and we've heard from our previous presenters, materially impact the warfighting capabilities of the combatant elements of the Navy. And they're obviously being subjected to sustained and not so benign neglect. So thank you for bringing both a situational awareness on this part of the story to us, as well as some recommendations as to what needs to be done. We're going to hear finally from Colonel Grant Newsom. He is one of our duty regulars on these webinars. We're appreciative to all of our speakers, of course, but especially to Grant, because typically what this entails for him is being up in ridiculously late hours of the night to join us. But he does so faithfully and always with profound impact. Grant is a colonel, now retired from the United States Marine Corps. He served as well in the embassy in Tokyo as a foreign service officer for a time, and he has been a businessman in East Asia for quite a number of years now, having left government service. He is the author, most recently, of a very important book. It's entitled When China Attacks, A Warning to America. He is also, I'm proud to say, a senior fellow of our Center for Security Policy, as well as, again, a valued member of our Committee on the Present Danger of China. Colonel Newsom, welcome aboard, sir. The floor is yours.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the opportunity, Frank. Well, I'm going to talk about two things. And the first, I'm going to talk about Marine Corps. And then I'm going to talk about our situation in the Pacific and how we might fare. Now, the Marine Corps, the first one, first I want to start with a story. In about 2006, the then Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, General Conway, went to China and he visited the Chinese Marine Corps. And he gave them the equivalent of a short speech. It was a short speech, the equivalent of telling them, boys, master your profession. Well, they did. They took it to heart, and the Chinese have got a Marine Corps now. They always had one. It's much bigger than it was, and it's much better. So the Chinese do have a Marine Corps. It depends on who you talk to, but it's got up somewhere around 70,000 Marines, about 6 brigades. It's got an air brigade, so it has its own helicopters and the like, as a special forces or special operation forces brigade as well. Has armor, amphibious assault vehicles. It's got all the things that U.S. Marines would recognize. And it is intended for amphibious assaults, and to include not just over the ocean, but heliborne assaults as well. Their concepts of operation are very similar to ours. They have an amphibious fleet as well. It's got about 3 of what we would consider LHAs, like the Wasp class amphibious ship, the big decks. You can put 900 Chinese Marines in with all their equipment. They have the other LPDs, the sorts of smaller amphibs. They've got a number of older amphibious ships as well that serve very nicely. And they have also managed to work in civilian ferries and roll-on, roll-off ships as well. So you can see that this sounds a lot like a U.S. Marine Corps, and that's what they've really have put together. And a lot of the purpose here is, of course, intended to be used against Taiwan, but also the intention is to use it overseas, worldwide, to protect China's overseas interests. Now, China has the capability now, if it wanted to put together at least 5 or 6 MU-ARGs, the Marine Expeditionary Units Amphibious Ready Groups. That's really the bread and butter of the U.S. Marine Corps, U.S. Navy amphibious team. They haven't done it yet, but I expect that sometime in the not too distant future, we're going to see Chinese MUs and ARGs making the rounds, for starters in the Asia-Pacific region, and eventually worldwide. Their objectives are global, and the Marine Corps, the Chinese Marine Corps, plays a major role in that, particularly in global operations. Now, this is what we face, and it's also worth noting that the Chinese also have at least 3 brigades of army troops who are trained in amphibious operations. So they have emphasized the development of an amphibious force for the same reasons that we do. Of course, they have Taiwan that's in the crosshairs, but nonetheless, the Chinese Marines and their amphibious force will be a global force eventually. Now, the U.S. Marine Corps, of course, is still the Marines, and they can cause plenty of hurt to people. They've had some trouble recently, in recent years, getting enough amphibious ships to move them around. And of course, they're sort of torn apart. The Marines by this new concept for turning the Marine Corps into a sort of a smaller, lighter force that focuses on small missile teams deployed here and there to take pot shots at Chinese ships. That's a bit of an overstatement. But the Marine Corps is still formidable, but it has some troubles it's dealing with. Now, looking at a fight in Asia, what would you do? What would the Marines do? Well, the U.S. Marines, that is. There's a lot of places that you can actually deploy Marines in fairly large numbers usefully, but I wouldn't expect a replay of World War II. The Iwo Jimas, PLA, and that sort of Saipan and that sort of attack, partly because the Chinese are not in place anywhere in the region where we would need to go root them out. Probably best to say they're not in place anywhere yet. But for now, we don't have to repeat that. But there's a number of areas of key geography, key terrain, where the Marines could be usefully employed. And this would be obviously the SLOCs, the sea lines, the narrow gaps through which ships can move. Say the Straits of Malacca is an obvious one, but you might want to put Marines down there to actually block and hold that territory. But also, if the Chinese Marines make a move somewhere, the U.S. Marines may have to go take them out. So it's always a little hard to predict where you will use Marines, but there should be plenty of possibilities for that. How would you use them in a Taiwan scenario? If the Chinese go after Taiwan, well, you would have to be very careful how you did it. And this will probably sort of be whatever the Marines do would be sort of a sideline. I can't see them getting directly involved in Taiwan, except in very small units, say for coordinating air gunfire support. But nonetheless, the Marines do have a role to play in the Pacific, but it will look different than the World War II experience. I would expect a fight in the Pacific to be largely a naval and air operation. And that's why the importance of having a competent Navy, a capable Navy, and an Air Force obviously speaks for itself. Now, what would my concern I've got, of course, is we may find ourselves, if we're not careful, sooner than we think, in a position where we're not able to move, and not at any reasonable cost. You know, the idea that we will always have time and space and the ability to get all our forces together and go on the offensive. Well, maybe not. And there's some reasons why I'm very concerned. And one is the military overmatch. The Chinese Navy has gotten much bigger than us. The Chinese buildup is just astonishingly fast. And you wonder if America has the resources to deploy enough to the Pacific, or to have enough there, that would actually give the Chinese pause. In fact, if the way things are playing out, you could see us, as I said, not being able to move. Part of the problem, of course, is we have partners and allies. Well, which one of them can we actually do a real world short notice operation with? Not many of them. In fact, the number's about zero, except for some limited circumstances involving the South Koreans. So our partners aren't quite the advantage we think they are. And then there's something called the gray zone, where that is like an incantation, where the Chinese do something, we call it the gray zone, and we can't move. And that further puts us at a disadvantage. The Chinese are playing that for all it's worth, and it's putting us on the back foot. Finally, we don't do political warfare anymore. So America could you could find that we get the military part right. We rebuild our military, but because we have not done political warfare while the Chinese have, we find that we have very little support in these regional nations for our presence, and we're told to go home, or at least don't come and, we don't want to fight, so stand clear. And you also will find the political warfare efforts in Japan, Taiwan, etc. And those are things that cause us a lot of concern. So what do? Rebuild the military, force our partners to actually be able to fight, and to fight with us. And not just force them, but we have to do what's necessary so that happens. And finally, get over this gray zone hypnosis and consider those acts of war, respond accordingly. And the last thing, relearn political warfare. We used to know it. Go on, understand what the Chinese are doing, but also go on the offensive. And if you do that, we have a reasonable chance. If we don't, then we have a good chance of coming out on the short end in a fight in the Pacific, regardless of having Marines or not. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Colonel Newsom. Well, one always feels better having Marines, that's for sure. And Simplify to you, we're grateful to you for your service as well as what you are rendering these days. Let's begin a quick round of questions. I wanted to come back to you, Captain Fennell, first to address something that I don't think anybody has mentioned to this point, though I know it has come up in my conversations with you and you with others in separate settings, namely the fact that the numbers of vessels that we are confronting on the Chinese side is vastly larger, and not just the auxiliaries, but actual combatants as well, branded as white-hulled Coast Guard vessels, or somewhat lighter armed but still armed maritime police, and I think even some of their fishing vessels equipped to do ramming operations. And then, if I might ask you to add into that mix, one of the slides that Captain Bolton showed indicated the prodigious number of Chinese commercial vessels that are on the world's oceans. Could you speak to the extent to which we believe, in the unclassified arena at least some of them may have containerized cruise missiles or anti-aircraft missiles or shipping weapons of other kinds aboard them, making them essentially weapons platforms too?
Yeah, Frank, the Chinese, I've called it their maritime strategy. They have their own maritime strategy, and they talk about it. They may not classify it exactly the same way that we have. But their strategy is layered. So they have the PLA Navy combatants, then they have the Chinese Coast Guard, which is the largest Coast Guard in the world, equipped with ships that are essentially some of them larger than the largest U.S. Navy combatants are destroyers, over 10,000 tons. Some of their Coast Guard cutters are 12,000 tons. Then they have what they call the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, which are essentially former PLA Navy sailors that are operating on fishing vessels that are essentially there to help ramrod around other fishing fleets. And then you have the actual Chinese fishing fleet, which is the largest fishing fleet in the world as well. So for instance, on Monday, we saw at Sabina Shoal in the South China Sea, we saw the Philippines try to resupply one of their cutters that had been at anchor at Sabina Shoal for some time, 120 days. And they sent in 2 smaller vessels, Coast Guard vessels from the Philippine Coast Guard to resupply this vessel. And the Chinese were able to bring to bear 3 PLA Navy warships, 6 Chinese Coast Guard cutters, 31 People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia vessels, plus their fishing fleet. And that resupply operation did not happen. So that's how China is essentially controlling the South China Sea today. Even though in 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration said they had no claim to those waters, China has, by de facto possession as 9/10 of the law, been able to do this. And they're doing it on a daily basis in the South China Sea. And they have 3 major naval bases there to support those platforms: Mischief Reef, Subi Reef, and Fiery Cross Reef, each with a 10,000-foot runway and a major naval base there the size of Pearl Harbor at each one of those locations. So they're in control of the South China Sea with the military that they have. When you talk about the merchant fleet, as Captain Bolton mentioned, we're less than 200 ships, 180. China's merchant fleet is 7,000 ships compared to 180 for us. That's a dramatic shift. And so, yes, it's quite likely that some percentage of that 7,000 has been given the task in the event of a conflict to be able to deliver containerized anti-ship cruise missiles. So that's another added stress onto us, in addition to the commercial issues and the war at sea issues and the resupply issues and all of those amphibious issues that Grant mentioned. You have to worry about now what happens if a container ship from China pulls into Long Beach or Seattle or somewhere on the East Coast. That you've got to worry about that, and we're not really paying attention to that. So these are critically important issues, and they get back to the fact that we have just walked away from being a maritime nation. And so my last thing, and then I'll shut up, is we need to have leadership, as Captain Bolton said, and we need to have a 2-ocean Navy Act like we did in 1940, where we were pumping out carriers, cruisers, battleships on industrial scale. And that won't happen overnight, but we have to do that. Otherwise, we will be dominated by the PRC.
Can I just ask one further question on the ports? You mentioned prospect of Chinese ships, commercial ships, being in our ports with some nasty surprises in their containers. There's also been this question of late, as you know, of the cranes used to move stuff on and off their ships and ours, for that matter, actually having been weaponized by the Chinese for intelligence purposes, including presumably monitoring intensively the throughput of war material for our Navy, among other things. There's been talk, as I understand it, of removing those cranes. Is that in fact happening, or are we simply trying to reverse engineer them and neutralize what the Chinese may have put into them, or do we in fact have alternatives?
Well, Frank, my understanding is we're treating the crane situation much like we treated Huawei and the spy balloon and other things. There's a lot of expressed outrage and a lot of speeches on Fox News and other outlets that say we're angry about such and such, but there's really no follow through. So I don't believe there's any work being done to remove these crane operating systems. I wouldn't be so worried so much about the intelligence per se as what they saw and learned from COVID. And they learned that if they can disrupt our supply chain as a nation, they can bring America to its knees, because Americans can't go without anything for any period of time. So we got some problems there too.
Captain Bolton, you have emphasized, of course, not only the aging inventory of our merchant ships, and I guess the the Navy's auxiliaries for that matter. But you've placed an emphasis, of course, as well on the manpower piece of it, very helpfully. Could you talk a little bit about the extent to which the economics of it, as you've described them, are the critical determinant of whether people are willing to serve in what are, I don't need to tell you, generally difficult and labor-intensive hardship roles on these various vessels, and I'm very reluctant to just throw this into the mix because I've tried intermittently for decades to figure out what the Jones Act is and how it contributes to the problems we have, and whether there's any prospect of remediating that. Could you say just a few words in addition about the Jones Act as you see it as a problem and what needs to be done about it?
Sure. I think the Jones Act was developed with good intentions, but right now the Jones Act, a series of regulations and rules that prevents the U.S. flag merchant fleet from being competitive with the international fleet. And there are many elements of that.
And why is that?
I'll just give it an example, is that in order for a ship to go from one U.S. port to another U.S. port, it must have been built in the United States. Well, if we can't afford to build the ships in the United States, we can't provide that trade. So that's just one example. Then there's a lot of issues about the crew members' rights under maintenance and cure and others to litigate against the companies. And so there are many issues along those lines, which basically makes the Jones Act at this point either needs to be totally revamped or new protections put forth to protect us from on the cabotage laws, because we don't want Chinese sailors going up and down the Mississippi River. So we want to preserve those employment jobs for American citizens. But I suggest that at this point, we got to say, all right, we can build the ships under the U.S. flag overseas, but we can still apply the coastwise trade, things like that. So it's a complicated
could you define
issue,
cabotage, sir? I'm sure that's common parlance in your world, but it's not one I know.
Basically, that U.S. trade within a country must be conducted by the flag of that country with those sailors.
So the technical term for that is cabotage. So it's a sailor's issue, it's a ship issue, both of that.
But if our sailors can't be internationally competitive, then why would any company want to hire them? And if our present wage scale is such, with the labor unions involved in things like that, is why would an individual want to go to sea to begin with? There are better jobs ashore. And so it's an economic issue. I mean, so potentially, what if we made those who go to sea tax exempt, as if they're out of the country for a period of time? There are many other ways of incentivizing people to go to sea. But right now, with those MSC ships laid up, it's unbelievable.
Key set of considerations that I think we're going to have to explore a bit further. Colonel Newsome, I think your anecdote about former Commandant Conway's comments is so instructive, and I think Captain Fennell, you and I've talked about this as well, and former four-star, as I recall, telling the media that he would be delighted, a naval aviator at that, that he would be delighted to teach the Chinese how to do carrier operations. Whence comes this sort of attitude, and is it still operating in the spirit of what Jake Sullivan was talking about, military to military relations, to the detriment of our national security and the benefit of, the ability for offensive operations against us of our mortal enemy, the Chinese Communist Party's military? Or have the scales fallen from the eyes, as you see it, sir, the light of what is now, as the Captain Fennell has said, transparently a military threat to this country?
It's much better now. I think you can't overstate just how bad it was until about 2016. General Conway going to China was considered like a really great thing. And anyone who said otherwise, and there were people saying otherwise, there's at least two of them on this phone call, were not well treated. What they had to say was not welcome. They were best ostracized, told to shut up, and at worst, they were sort of forced to resign. But it's better now. In that 2016, well, that's when Mr. Trump came along. Before that, you could not even say China was an adversary. You couldn't even say that. But now that we've had this new administration, it does seem as though things have shifted back in the wrong direction a bit, where there's this mad rush to engage with the Chinese, to talk to them, deal with them, and this is the wrong approach. And it just doesn't, there is an understanding that China is an adversary, an enemy, but I'm not sure that there's the sense of urgency, that there's the real fear, the real recognition of the threat that they pose, even within our military. But by and large, it's much better than it was. But I do wish we would get over this insanity that we have to engage with the Chinese, that they're just a friend that we haven't made yet. And you think we'd know better than that.
Captain Fennell, speaking of engaging again, you, of course, have written a book with Brad Thayer, as I mentioned earlier, Embracing Communist China, in which you describe it as America's greatest strategic failure. You have, I heard you on Steve Bannon's program yesterday, I believe, talking very pointedly about the mistake this represents and the dangers, as we have talked about and tried to chronicle on these webinars relentlessly, including this book that synthesizes a lot of that information, The Indictment that Didier Lagesson and I wrote last year. This is a formula for our defeat. I did want to just read to you, these are, to be sure, the comments that are reported by the Chinese Communist Party about Jake Sullivan's presentations to Xi Jinping in the course of their meeting yesterday, I believe it was. He said that that the United States does not seek a new Cold War. It does not seek to change China's system. The revitalization of U.S. alliances is not against China. The United States does not support Taiwan independence, quote unquote. It does not seek conflict with China. The one China policy of the United States has not changed, and it has no intention of using China as a tool to contain Taiwan to contain China. I'm quite sure that most of those are kind of incantations that go back to Henry Kissinger back in the days when he was in government, and of course what he did in the years afterwards. But does this sound like a guy who is, well, either clueless about the realities that we've been talking about in the course of this program, or so completely captured as part of the captured elite of China's United Front Work Department, which we spoke about in a recent one of these webinars, that that he's essentially mouthing the platitudes that the Chinese are dictating to us. And what does it say about engagement, I guess, is the point. To Captain Fennell, if I may, please.
Yeah, Frank, I think what we see is, as Grant mentioned, is we're seeing a return to what Brad and I call neo-engagement. There was a break during the Trump administration where you had folks like Secretary Pompeo who said, we're not going to pursue blind engagement. We're going to shut down a consulate in Houston because we knew they were spying on us. We had other areas where we were trying to protect America's national interests. And that was a break from almost 40 years of engagement policy. And now over the course of the last year and a half, the Biden-Harris administration has returned to engagement. And this visit by the National Security Advisor Sullivan and some of the other reporting from the Chinese side said that they commented that, you know, since they resumed mill-to-mill talks 10 months ago after the summit in Woodside, where Xi and Biden met in San Francisco, that they have been now having high-level mill-to-mill discussions at the SecDef level with his Chinese counterparts, and now the National Security Advisor goes, and they came out and said, and one of the benefits is we're going to talk and have our Indo-PACOM commander talk with their counterpart in China. And what I keep asking is, well, we've had all this engagement for 10 months. Has the temperature gotten cooler in the Far East? Are things better? Are things better for the Filipino sailor who lost his thumb? Is it better for the sailors that were bashed about by water cannons by the Chinese? Is it better for Taiwan, or circled every day by Chinese warships and aircraft? Is it better for a whole host of things that the Chinese military is doing? Are these mill-to-mill engagements paying off? And it seems that nobody inside the Pentagon, and certainly this administration, wants to do empirical research to say, we said engagement was going to make things better. Let's take a snapshot look at the last 10 months and see if it's better. And it's not. Empirically, it's not better. But as you suggest, it suggests either they're really idiots and stupid, or they've been bought off and they really believe into this ideology of engagement. And I fear that it's the latter, that we have people that are demonstrated that they believe that engagement is the best way because they fundamentally believe that America is declining and China is rising, and they want to manage that situation and the decline of America so that they can somehow say that they've managed to keep America afloat, much like the British did with their Navy sinking at the pier, if you will. So this is the challenge for us: is are we going to fight for this nation? And as the former president said a few weeks ago, are we going to fight, or are we going to give up?
I'm so glad you made the point about managing the decline of the United States, because that does seem to be operating. A corollary to it, and I know it's true of many in the business sector, financial, capital markets community, I think Hollywood, the media, and probably in government too, who have been among the captured elites of China, think it'll be better for them, having helped manage the decline, because they'll be treated better under the new order of things. We've talked about this on this series in the past. I think they're woefully miscalculating, as it is generally the case that the people who are put up against the wall first and shot when folks like the Chinese communists take over are those who have betrayed their country and been useful idiots, as you say, or worse. I did want to ask Jay Bolton, if I could. Mention has been made, I think, by you and several of our other participants about this tying up of the 17 military Sea Lift Command auxiliaries. Captain Fennell has made the argument that this will have a profound ripple effect. I'm told it's something on the order of, I heard 18% of the total inventory of these vessels. Could you just provide a little bit more texture as to what that ripple effect translates into in terms of actual operations? And what I'm particularly interested in is, how do the Chinese communists look at us doing this? What is it telling them about, well, yes, the manpower conditions in the United States, but more generally about the resolve of us to meet them in this battle space?
I might also add that the Coast Guard has the same situation. They're laying up ships and not enough people. On the ships that are being laid up for that's Military Sea Lift Command, is that correct, Captain?
Correct.
Are they manned by civilians or Navy personnel?
There's a mixture, but mostly civilians.
Okay. Again, that may be the shortage of people and the work rest rules that the Navy has on the civilian crews. I don't know the details of that. But if the economic incentive from a merchant perspective, from a commercial perspective is there, those ships should be properly manned. I mean, I've got to believe there's something that's keeping people from wanting to go into the Military Sea Lift Command to begin with. I don't know the answer to that.
That wasn't really the question, but it's not an irrelevant point, obviously. But if you wanted to undermine the effectiveness of the United States Navy, presumably one of the things you do is prevent resupply from being made available to the operations, as Captain Fennell said.
Sure.
Do you have a sense of, I mean, just based on your past experience, that how profound that impact would be?
It goes back to even Vietnam. Without the bullets, you can't shoot. Without the food, you can't feed the troops. You can't, and that's why the merchant marine is so critical. During WW2, during Vietnam War, we needed to get the stuff over there. So without that ability to transport war material of all kinds overseas, we're up the creek.
No.
So that's, you can have all of the ships in the world, but if you can't get the material over there, you're screwed.
And that's the point that I just wanted to draw you out on, because it does seem to me this is the soft underbelly maybe of bigger problem that we have. And Colonel Newsom, you talked about political warfare as a lost art in this country. One of the things I was struck by in that quote that I just read from the Chinese, yes, but putatively from Jake Sullivan, that we're not interested in changing the Chinese system. I know you've been giving a lot of thought to this, as have Captain Fennell and Brad Thayer, of course, and others of our team. Well, our Committee on the Present Danger of China more generally, as to there really being any alternative as a practical matter to the prevention of a war with China, but that regime fall. And that as it happens at this very moment, as you know so well, sir, the conditions inside China are as parlous for the regime as they've probably been since Mao's time. And were we, for example, to just stop financing the Chinese Communist Party, which 100 million or so of us are doing, most of us unwittingly, through our investments in, pension funds and 401k plans and mutual funds, exchange traded funds, and other investment vehicles out of Wall Street, we might well be at a point where we could help the Chinese people. It'll be to them, of course, but help the Chinese people change their system. Could you comment on that as not only an object of political warfare, but the importance of pursuing it?
Well, I think the only alternative to having a war with China is to surrender. The Chinese have been very clear about what they intend for us and our system, and just listen to what Xi Jinping says. Listen to what they've been saying since 1949. But read, it's called Document 9, and it's a speech by Xi Jinping. He gave it in 2013, and that lays it out. They want to destroy us. And there's no deal to be cut with people like that. And if they wish to destroy us, well, turnabout is fair play. And if we don't recognize that we are in a fight, then we are going to lose. And I referred to political warfare, and just to be clear, what that is it means you use every element of national power, short of war, to get your national objectives, and that is to defend the country. It's to make it so our enemies can't hurt us. And elements of national power, economic, financial, diplomatic, intelligence, the military, and propaganda. And that just means explaining yourself and defending and promoting our own system, which obviously people want, given our illegal immigration problem. China doesn't have one. But we have forgotten how to put all of that into a coherent plan and to articulate it. And the Chinese know how to do it for themselves, but we just don't do it. It's almost a dirty word. I actually mentioned it to a very, very, very senior military officer 2 days ago, and he didn't even know what I was talking about. He accused me of being cynical. God help us. But we know what we need to do. We just have to go do it.
Amen. I wondered if I could ask a favor of each of you to just take a minute. We're almost at the end of our time, to respond to something that Seth Cropsey addressed at the end of his remarks, and that is, what should our strategy be? You've kind of laid out your view on that, Colonel. Maybe I'd just ask you to repackage it for the purposes of answering this question. But Seth has argued, and I think it's sensible, of course, that while sizing the Navy and figuring out what kind of capabilities it must have, as well as, let's face it, the military more generally, it depends in no small measure on what the purpose of that Navy or military is. In addition to essentially using unrestricted warfare of the kind the Chinese have used against us, which is, I think, how you just described political warfare in your parlance, what should our strategy be towards China and the instruments by which we sort of figure out what we need in the way of military capabilities, sir? Colonel?
First thing is don't do anything that helps them. And by providing them money, technology, and accommodating everything they do, no matter how wrong it is, we have just guaranteed we're going to lose. But that's a basic rule. Ronald Reagan, that was his basic guideline during the Cold War, during his term, was don't do anything that helps the Russians. And similarly, we should use that as a sort of a guideline, and also at a minimum reciprocity. If you can't do something in China, they shouldn't be able to do it here. So those are a couple things that we could use as sort of to get our bearings right.
Very helpful. Captain Bolton, your thoughts, sir? What the strategy should be?
In my view, very simply, we need to adopt a commercial strategy that allows us to beat the crap out of them economically, globally. That's the answer to everything. So that means figuring out our tax structure, our employment structure in the United States to incentivize the maritime industry in general to flourish. Without that strategy, I don't see any continuance of the maritime component or the sea lift component, if you will.
I guess this is a sort of microcosmic example of the larger point that you can't rely on them for your supply chains of everything, or trade imbalances of the kind we've been suffering.
So every Chinese ship that comes into the United States is balance of trade, money going out.
You bet it is.
So
and damage being done in as well.
Exactly.
Captain Fennell, lastly to you, what would you say in a succinct 1 minute should be the strategy of the United States Navy and more generally?
In the context of this webinar, we are a seafaring nation. Our founders realized early on that when the British or the Royal Navy were able to sit off our shore and bombard us and offload troops and run us around, that was not a good situation. And so they instituted a constitution that said we will have a navy. And they learned from the British, and they learned from the Romans and the Spanish. And these are centuries-long lessons in life. And we are a seafaring nation. And until we get back to being a seafaring nation, we are at the risk of the PRC. And as Grant mentioned, they know what they want to do to us. So when you don't have a navy and they do, guess what happens to all that economic stuff that Captain Bolton was talking about? It won't happen. They will strangle us in every way, shape, and form. And all those people that work at Apple and Boeing and you name the company that want their goods to come across the Pacific, that's not going to happen unless Xi and the party say it will happen, just like they're doing right now in the South China Sea. It will happen to us.
Thank you, gentlemen. A bracing conversation, really, from all of you. I would only add that I agree with each of those recommendations and simply reiterate the point that as my old boss, Ronald Reagan, had it, and Colonel Newsom's pointed this out, it's also the subject, I'm excited to say, of a new movie coming to theaters tomorrow about Reagan. Just how intent he was on bringing down what he considered to be his time's existential threat to freedom. I'm proud to say that I played a bit role in helping him do that, but it was an extraordinary undertaking, and it is needed today in a way that makes what was true of the Soviet threat pale into almost insignificance. This is a moment when the Chinese Communist Party must be taken down. And I think, as I said earlier, there is an opportunity to do it. In fact, we're launching a new campaign entitled Defund the Enemy. And it's keying off in part of some of the insights of our colleague Roger Robinson and work that, with his help, Maria Bartiromo has showcased in a terrific special, which I commend to all of you at Fox Nation, entitled Underwriting the Enemy. We need to stop doing that, of course, if we want to ensure that it is not able to destroy us as they've intently pursued for all these years. With that, we'll turn it back over to my friend and colleague Didi Laugesen with thanks again to Seth Cropsey, to Jim Fennell, to Jay Bolton, and of course to Grant Newsom, and to all of you for helping us disseminate this video, which will be posted thanks to Oleg Beshin very shortly. God bless you all. Carry on.
Thank you, Frank. Thanks, everyone. A video of this webinar will be posted to presentdangerchina.org within a day or two of the end of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for joining us today, and goodbye.